Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another session of the Critical Media Literacy Conference of the Americas. My name is Justin Brown. I'm a host at the UCLA chapter of CMLCA. Today we have Nolan Higdon giving his presentation on surveillance education, navigating the conspicuous absence of privacy in schools. I'd like to read Nolan's bio real quick. So Nolan Higdon is a founding member of the Critical Media Literacy Conference of the Americas, Project's censored national judge, author, and lecturer at Merrill College and the Education Department at University of California, Santa Cruz. Higdon's areas of concentration include podcasting, digital culture, news media history and propaganda, and critical media literacy. All of Higdon's work is available at Substack. He is the author of The Anatomy of Fake News, a critical news literacy education, Let's Agree to Disagree, a critical thinking guide to communication, conflict management, and critical media literacy, and The Media and Me, a guide to critical media literacy for young people. Higdon is a regular source of expertise for CBS, NBC, the New York Times, and the San Francisco Chronicle. Everybody make some noise and show some reactions for Nolan.
All right. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Justin, and thank you to the conference organizers as well. This is a great conference. Glad to see how it's developed and honored to be a part of it today. What I want to do today here, my colleague and myself, colleague Allison Butler from University of Massachusetts Amherst. The last handful of years, we've been working on a book titled Navigating the Conspicuous Absence of Privacy in Schools. And we are proud to say we are just getting ready to submit that to our publisher, Routledge. And so I want to share a little bit about the text and what we found, and then really open it up for a Q&A to talk with you folks about it. And so what I plan to do is to go through the text in order, kind of briefly summarize what's in the text, some of the key points we make, and then I'd like to hear from all of you, both in terms of your comments and your questions. I know sometimes I think of a question, maybe I don't have something to write it down in front of me or whatever it may be. If you want to put your question in the chat, after I'm done going through a quick summary of the chapters, I'll go back through the chat and read those questions as well. If there's a question that's pertinent to what I'm saying, feel free to also put it in the chat. I'll keep an eye on the chat. One of the skills I developed in teaching during the pandemic is how to keep an eye on the chat while also teaching. So I think I can do that while presenting as well. Okay, so that's what we'll go ahead and get started. The genesis for this text, like so many great texts, came just from having questions and reaching out to colleagues about them. And for me, I was teaching in a lecture hall about I guess 6 or 7 years ago, and given a lecture, and there was a student in there who had accommodations, and one of the accommodations was they wanted me to wear a headset while I lectured. And everything that was being said in the class by myself and the other students would be sent out to a third party who would transcribe what was being said in real time to one of the students in the room. And I was sort of caught off guard by this. There was basically a legal reason to have a third party listening in on the classroom. And I was wondering how that could be legal. Especially when this third party was not, directly associated with the school. It was an outside company who had contracted with the school. And so I began asking colleagues about this and hearing a lot of their stories about how, not just through accommodations, but other requirements and policies on campus, they were being asked to use corporate software as part of the process of being an educator. And so I wanted to dive deeper to understand more about how this process was legal and what effects it might have on actual teaching in the classroom. What effect might this have on students and the outcome? And so that was the genesis for the book. Allison and Butler and I have worked on numerous projects together in the critical media literacy space. We both had a funny conversation where we decided that this was a hill we were willing to die on, to push back against some of this corporate software in the classroom being mandated. And that's basically how the text ended up coming about. And for folks who join late, I'll try to keep reminding folks that I'm a co-author on this project, working with Allison Butler, and she deserves as much credit as myself for how much people like or dislike what ultimately emerges. So the text, we start with a introduction chapter that really places today's schooling in the context of neoliberal governance and surveillance capitalism. So we define those concepts and how neoliberal logic has not only shaped schooling in the 21st century, but it's also shaped the ways in which tools are created and utilized in the education space as well. And in the introduction, we also prime audiences for the ways in which surveillance capitalism has emerged as a strong economic force out of this neoliberal logic. And I can get more into this in the Q&A, but in short, surveillance capitalism is the sexy academic term for this new economic order that tries to change people into the product, transform people into data mines that can be mined, and the fruits of that labor, that is everything that people do online, will go to a handful of companies who use that data to sell to multiple interested parties, whether it be governments, whether it be private industry, nonprofits, political parties, whatever it may be. Many folks have a vested interest in accumulating and purchasing data. And so that's where the text kind of lays that groundwork. And it also talks about our methodology as well, which in our methodology, we want to interview a lot of people who are working in education with these tools. So we talk to counselors, and we talk to teachers, and we talk to students, and we talk to administrators. We talk to people in the ed tech industry. And then we also reviewed critical legal governmental documents. We also looked at news reports, a lot of news reports, as you'll hear. Those ended up being very important, as is expected. And so we wanted to be able to finally use these with our methodology. Our goal here was to be able to write a text where people could start to understand not only what type of surveillance is going on, but who's behind the surveillance, what their motives are. One of the things I think is most important, which I'll talk about in a moment, the threats that are posed by erasing privacy in schools. But we didn't want to leave audiences with a depressing list of all the things that are wrong with surveillance capitalism, neoliberal governance, and contemporary education. We also want to talk about some solutions. So we have, the book ends with a pretty hefty list of solutions and some strategies for teaching about this stuff in the classroom as well, which Allison and myself wrote a pretty robust lesson plan and exercises and lessons that educators can use to address this issue. So from there, we went into, and I should specify one other thing. We also took a global lens when looking at this as well. So I will admit it's heavy on US sources, but we did take a global lens, which really benefits the final product, understanding how this is being utilized around the globe, and finding a lot of differences, which are important, but also a lot of commonalities in how we think about surveillance capitalism in schools. And so the first chapter, Allison and myself, we did a deep dive into legality of school surveillance. And so in this chapter, we delineated the history of privacy rights across the globe. In there, we also talked about the philosophical reasons for why people want and need privacy. Privacy has, and it's not hyperbolic to say, privacy has been essential to survival throughout human history. But sometimes the human experience also has necessitated giving up some privacy for survival as well. And so we talk about some of that in the text, and then we talk about the different historically and globally, how legal frameworks have been created to protect people's privacy in general and in schools in particular. And in the United States, one of the things we first looked at, because I and Allison had done a lot of, in addition to being educators, we've done a lot of administrative work and collective bargaining work and work with academic senates. We know there's this important law in the United States called FERPA that students protested and advocated for out of the rights movements in the United States in the 50s and 60s. And FERPA is a legal protection that educational institutions are highly restrained in who they can give up students' private information to. I teach in a higher ed context, and I know occasionally parents will reach out to me for information about their child, and I have to say, like, even if your child is registered in my class, I could not even admit it. FERPA doesn't even allow me to give that information out to anyone. So I was wondering, how is it possible that educators were so restrained with collecting and sharing information on our students by FERPA, but here these ed tech corporations are able to come into the classroom, collect data and information, and have a legal right to share it with other institutions and companies. And what we found was that there was a change in the FERPA laws made in 2012. This was under the Obama administration. And the argument was that schools are now using more and more digital platforms, and they're collecting data on their students in digital texts, and they're relying on ed tech companies to do this. And so FERPA is simply outdated. FERPA is an unnecessary blockade to what they saw as the techno-utopian progress of ed tech tools in the school space. And what the new law said after 2012 essentially was that schools can share student data with these companies because these companies are what are known as educational partners. And so this created a weird loophole that was very profitable for ed tech companies. I'm going back to my higher ed example. So I can't share information about a parent's child being in my class in higher ed, but this ed tech company can know everything about their child. It's set a really new precedent. And to be honest, a lot of this is the case around the globe. We found this same loophole existing. And we point out at the end of that chapter that the changes to FERPA and FERPA and the loopholes that are in FERPA around, like the FERPA-like loopholes around the globe, these are things that I think those privacy rights advocates and student rights advocates need to think about going back and fixing. But while we're fixing these new loopholes that are created since 2012, we also have AI staring us down. And we talk in that chapter about the lack of legal framework around AI and already some of the problems that are starting to emerge with AI and the need to be proactive, legally speaking, with so-called artificial intelligence. But we can talk later about why people are intelligent and this crap is not. But so from there, we go to chapter 2, and chapter 2 answers, I think, a basic question a lot of people have, asked us when we told them we're working on this project, which is like, well, okay, well, who is spying on the classroom and for what purpose? Because from where a lot of people stand in the educational space, they see a lot of these companies as simply just serving a function. We need to know more about our students, or we need to know about who's succeeding, or whatever. What are they really doing with this data, and who are the they? And that was what this chapter tried to lay out, chapter 2. And in that, we noted that obviously there are ed tech companies who are collecting data, and this is where we kind of demystify the educational partner argument for ed tech companies. This has happened over the last 10 years, but especially ramped up in 2019. A lot of equity firms started to purchase these ed tech companies, and I'm thinking of like Canvas, which is under Instructor, for example, or there were like EAB is another big one that got bought out by an equity firm. But these equity firms, they would buy up these ed tech products, and these equity firms are not in the business of education; they're in the business of making money. And even though some schools may have been proactive enough to say to an ed tech company, okay, we're going to use Canvas on this campus, but you're not allowed to sell, student data. That doesn't stop them from sharing data or sharing analysis of that data. And what a lot of these equity firms, set up was basically mechanisms to track people's data from the cradle to the grave. They would, own one platform called like Baby Connect, for example, which monitors, newly born like infants. And then they would have one that's used specifically for grammar school, and then maybe like a high school setting, and then a college setting, and so on down the line. And so between these different companies, they're all owned by the same equity firm, which means the same equity firm has a huge window into individuals' privacy, which could be a lot of money. That's, again, lucrative data that potential parties may be interested in. We also found that governments are also behind the vast collection of data. Their motives range quite wide. Some is for safety, some is for improving education, some is for holding school systems accountable and efficient, some is for fighting terrorism, some is for trying to predict and proactively stop criminality. So for a lot of reasons, governments are also involved in working with these ed tech companies and other partners on some of this data analysis. In addition, the schools and school boards are also collecting data using some of these ed tech platforms as well. They argue that the collection of this is for the health and safety of the students, as well as student success as well. One of the things we point out in the text, and there's a lot of studies, this isn't a finding that we made, but that we cited a lot of these studies. There seems to be a real lack of evidence for making a connection between the utilization of ed tech tools in schools and this vast data collection and actual student success. In fact, a lot of the people we interviewed got very uncomfortable when we tried to pin them down on a definition of what student success actually is. And so that was a big finding, which kind of begged the question: if you can't define what student success is, how can you defend that these tools are actually succeeding in engendering it? We also, have to point out that in addition to those entities, educators are also participating in the surveillance process by choosing to use some of these tools, like a Turnitin to monitor plagiarism, or some of these tools that monitor online test takers to see if they're cheating. So they use those, again, because it's believed it'll make the job easier or more convenient, if you will. Families and students also use these tools as well. We saw that, we were surprised that some schools have actually started mandating like students putting their cell phones in cubbies for the day and digital devices in cubbies for the day. And in some of those studies, students were actually okay with it, students of all ages. It was actually parents who pushed back. Parents wanted the ability to, contact their child at any time or monitor what their child is doing at any time. And of course, we know, students also use some of these tools as well, which can track their work. We talk a lot about that in the book, about how students use some of these tools like ChatGPT and others, which are also part of the surveillance in education. So that chapter really lays out the details of who is surveilling and why. In my estimation, I think, the chapter I think is really the most important is chapter 3, most important in terms of making a contribution. As I said, we've been looking at this for 5 or 6 years at this point. So we've brought this up at many conferences and many public talks, as we are so privileged to give. And it's inevitable. Someone will always ask at the end or state at the end, well, yeah, I know all this surveillance is going on, but I got nothing to hide. Why do I really care? So somebody wants to know that I get up at 4 a.m. and post something on Facebook about, my favorite football team. Why do I care? That, we've had that response from a lot of people. And I think it's an understandable response. And I think, big tech is really good at creating a PR environment for itself where people miss a lot of the threats that are posed by the utilization of big tech unquestionably in general, but in schools in particular. And so some of the arguments we make in chapter 3, one is, surveillance is not secure. We found it nearly impossible to be able to count the amount of data breaches that happen at educational institutions on a daily basis. For a while we were collecting news articles, we just news articles we found, and we're talking thousands of data breaches happen. And it's not just student information, it's also faculty information. And if you transferred or graduated from the school, that information can also be captured as well. If you're a faculty, staff, or whatever, and you retired from an institution, that information can also be captured as well. And so these data breaches are quite common. So even though you may be okay with giving your data to a particular school or institution, that can go to many other partners. Some, like the educational partners, will take it and share it at their whims. Other outside actors could hack it and steal it as well. So the information is not secure. It's not always going to the party you agree to in that sense. We also looked at a lot of the studies about how surveillance undermines education. It undermines student autonomy, which is a critical part of the educational process. We talk about how a lot of these companies operate from an ethos where they think humans are not smart, digital devices are, or humans are not intelligent, these new platforms are. And we think it in a horrible way. If you use it incorrectly in the classroom, you condition students to believe that the human mind has its limits and should rely more on this kind of techno-utopian view to achieve whatever they're trying to achieve. Also, we found a lot of studies show that students are actually pretty aware of how much they're being surveilled and how much their information is being tracked. And so they respond in one of two ways, and both are problematic for the education process. One is they try not to participate because they don't want to share anything that's going to be used elsewhere, or they try to respond in a way that they think is acceptable to whoever is surveilling them. As an educator, I think we all know that part of an effective education process requires that students take risks and make mistakes and learn from said risks and mistakes. That's nothing new or radical. But when every mistake you make, could be collected and potentially utilized against you, a lot of students, understandably, are not willing to engage in that process. And then, being critical scholars, we also talked about the ways in which power inequities operate from this surveillance process. And how vulnerable populations are, doubly or more exploited than other populations as well. And we can talk about some of this in the Q&A, but just to give you some examples, like some of the devices that's when a student is taking a test at home remotely, there are some devices that a browser extension that faculty can require students to use, and it surveils the room to determine if a student is cheating. Well, a lot of the research has shown that those extensions are designed on very narrow groups of students. And so especially like ability challenge students or differently abled students, they're flagged as cheating because they're trying to use resources that give them an equitable education. So the programs mislabel them as cheating, which is just yet another hurdle for these students to engage in while trying to learn. We also talked about how sometimes the law can change as well. And for example, we use the example of how abortion access was more or less legal in the United States after 1973, and it was always legal, but there was always hurdles put on it by some states. Then all of a sudden it became illegal in many places due to the Dobbs decision here in the U.S. Well, now if you're communicating about trying to get an abortion in some states, you're committing a crime. So maybe you didn't care about being surveilled on the issue of abortion previously, but now you do care. The script has flipped on that. And when people are already going through difficult decisions, now there's the extra challenge of legal repercussions due to these surveillance mechanisms. Similarly, we talk about how victims of stalking are, may not want that data out there and accessible. We also talk about how these tools have been instituted in schools with a Islamic phobic tendency when it comes to determining the acceptable like dress wear for students. We see how there's a long history of women being policed on their looks and physicality, and the surveillance systems contribute to that in the digital age. And then we also talk about how racist these algorithms are as well. And I don't think I really need to tell this crowd this, but algorithms reflect the bias of their creators. And so when schools are using these algorithms to determine which students need more help, or which students are having problems, or in some cases to predict which students are going to be, commit violence like a school shooter, or which students are prone to criminality, we see that these algorithms perpetuate racist tropes. Making a connection between Black and the prediction there will be a criminal, and things of that nature. And so we talk about a lot of the research on that throughout the text as well. We also talk about the class inequities as well, how some wealthier students may be able to get their own digital devices and may be able to avoid some of this school surveillance. But a lot of poorer students, which are disproportionately in the United States, students of color, they're forced to use these school-issued devices, which track and surveil them for school-approved companies. And then we also talk about how migrant students, especially if their immigration status is being contested, they have a reason to want their privacy as well. And then we end that chapter talking about faculty and any employees on within a school. There's a case to be made. Historically, surveillance has been used to undermine labor movements and employee autonomy. And we write quite compellingly in the chapter that we see a direct threat between digital surveillance and concepts of academic freedom as they're historically understood. We point out that when schools and companies have this information, what is said and done in the classroom can be used against certain faculty to pressure them out of their jobs. And as we see the adjunctification of higher education, a lot of those instructors already have little job security, and so they're particularly vulnerable to this surveillance as well. So that's a brief kind of summary of the case we make in chapter 3 for why it's important. And then I'll wrap up because I want to get to the Q&A here by saying we have a fourth chapter and a conclusion. And in the fourth chapter, we make some points for some laws we would like to see changed around the globe. We think public institutions need to limit data collection. For too many ed tech companies, it's too profitable to break the law and pay a small fine for the amount of data you get. So I think we need to have more zero tolerance policies for ed tech companies, maybe the same zero tolerance policies that they treated students with. Obviously be more proactive with laws on artificial intelligence, close some of those loopholes I talked about. I think we need to create more rights. I think there needs to be a right to be erased across the globe. I also think if we're going to, operate within a capitalist system where these companies are making money, then everybody who does anything online, if you post on social media, if you are in the classroom using Canvas, if your data is getting input into platforms like Starfish, then you need to get paid for that. So we advocate for what we call a data dividend, which we got from Mark Blythe and his co-author on Angrynomics. They came up with that idea. And then we also gave some resources for folks who are doing this at the local level in schools and negotiating with these ed tech companies. about how to minimize surveillance, make sure it's proportional, be more open, transparent, and equity-minded in the process. Consider proprietary software, consider security, consider the right to be erased, and those things. And then we also talk about the necessity of having a community environment around this. Students, faculty, teachers, administrators, everybody, parents need to engage in substantive dialogue about these. And we also talk about things you can do at an individual level, separate technology use when possible, turn off notifications, clear cache, reject cookies, ask questions. We talk about utilizing librarians in the process of negotiating contracts and for those community discussions I talked about. And then we end chapter 4 by explaining that we need to see more, for those who are privileged enough to have a union, assuming it's actually a union that does something, not a feckless union, to actually push back against these policies and be much more aggressive in resisting the utilization of these ed tech tools. Try not to get distracted by ed tech's promise of how it's going to make things more convenient, more better, and how it's equity minded and DEI. Actually make them prove that. Don't just sort of drink the Kool-Aid, as it were. And then we have a conclusion where we highlight many of the real world stories and some of the pop culture tales that talk about steps we can take, because we noted that a lot of what's in the text can seem quite overwhelming. It's a major system at this point to resist, but we take comfort with what we see already emerging, and some of the ideas are out there, and we conclude talking about that. So that's the text in a nutshell, and I'm going to go ahead and close it there and open it up for Q&A. And I appreciate y'all giving me the opportunity to present. This was really cool. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nolan. So as you've said, does anyone have any questions? Feel free to drop them in the chat or unmute yourself. While everybody's getting their questions together, actually, I'm currently working on my degree as well. And, I use Canvas for the first time today. I looked into who owns Canvas, and I discovered that, the big three, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, all own shares in this. And, for people who don't know, those three groups own 89% of the S&P 500. So everything in the grocery store, all over the place, right? And I'm just wondering, how many missing pieces are there before surveillance in schools leads to advertising outside of it, and basically creating a total product of a person where, like, what you write about in class becomes the ad that you get on the way home?
It's a great question, and I think one of the things I need to say is one of the great frustrations is, because a lot of these companies are not publicly regulated in any meaningful way, we don't actually know what they're doing with a lot of the data, or what steps it takes to answer your question. But I think it's a great question that I would like to have answered. I think part of the answer, though, that we can say is that it seems insane to me that equity firms who have nothing to do with education would be putting all this money in for these data collection processes to not use it to make a profit. And so it's very clear in that sense. And you already brilliantly summarized some of the ownership and the effect that it has. One of the things, we notice, I'm affiliated with a lot of institutions, and so is Allison. And when you talk to the people who are responsible for implementing these on campus, they'll generally, in the United States, they'll generally hide behind the, well, we're FERPA compliant. So they'll always tell you they're compliant with the law, but as I pointed out, there's a lot of loopholes in the law. So that's how they kind of, I guess, prevent us, Justin, from being able to answer that question directly, is they hide behind the legal mechanism. So I think until in the United States and elsewhere, we get those sort of loopholes plugged and enforced, it's going to be tough to be able to answer that question.
Thank you. Michael Hoeksman?
Perfect, thanks. Yeah, fabulous presentation. Thanks to you and Allison. I keep waiting for what I call the Cambridge Analytica moment, so that all of this buildup will eventually come with something major that changes everything. And I guess I'm hearing you, I'm realizing that I'm thinking about collective harm. And I think Justin just touched on something, which is that we all become a market, just sources for market. But it's still not quite as heavy as the Cambridge Analytica moment. And I'm wondering what that is. And what I've learned from you today is that much of what happens like to atoms, like not to collectives. It happens to individuals. So it's a student at home, it's a faculty member losing their job, or at least their academic freedom. So it kind of invisibilizes it, because as an individual here and there suffers some consequence to this data because of this data collection, that can sort of, the society at large won't really pay attention. So that doubles the importance of your work, by the way. But I'm just wondering, where's the Cambridge Analytica moment? What's that moment of collective harm,
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think I can't predict the future. I'd be a lot wealthier if I did. I can't predict the future, but I would suspect that at some point we'll end up with some Cambridge Analytica moment, as you describe it, or some black swan event. What I think we're trying to do with this text, though, to speak to your question, is to prep people for that moment. One of the stories we found that I found powerful, and this speaks to your question about the collective, is in 1969, students at I think it was Harvard and Stanford and a handful of other institutions, they found out that their universities had contracts with the Pentagon. And in the United States, they were developing these tools, what would become the internet, GPS, touchscreen. All these devices were being created as part of the military industrial complex. And once they were made aware of that information and what was being done, they protested. They pushed back against their campus. They saw this as part of the rights revolution. And what I take from that story, I do believe that once people have this information, kind of like the Edward Snowden moment of 2013 or Cambridge Analytica, as you talked about as well, I think that's when we'll start to see this pushback and protest. But I think right now, so much of the knowledge of these tools is wrapped in great PR or advertising from big tech, and to even suggest like a minimization of technology as a way to improve education, you get treated like you're from like 19th century or something, or a Luddite or something. And so I think we have to do our work in making people aware of what the problem is, so we can get that moment. And my hope is, and I think Allison would agree with me, that we can hopefully achieve that before we have a Cambridge Analytica moment, before we have some moment where great harm is done to engender collective action. I hope it's knowledge of the problem that engenders that collective action.
I'm going to ask a follow-up, but it might get woven into the answer to someone else if there's other questions. But it's about ecosystems, and specifically the Google one, Google Classroom, Google Docs, Google Drive, etc. And the sort of matter-of-fact manner that it's become an everyday toolbox for educators. And surely this one, because it links into, it's a Hydra head, it links also into the YouTube videos you show in class, etc. Like, I mean, the data environment is total. So I just wonder if you could just speak to that, like the ecosystemic impact. And again, thanks for all your insights. It's great.
Thank you as always, Michael, for that support. It means a lot. Yeah, Google's an interesting case study. I mean, this is kind of getting in the weeds of history here, but Google's founders were big believers in a lot of the writing from like the Whole Earth catalog in early Silicon Valley. And, they saw their goal as replacing the inefficiencies of the human mind with technology. And now, looking 80 years, later from those writings, not Google was created 80 years, but 80 years ago from those writings, you really see Google trying to do that and do it almost enthusiastically. And I don't, I guess, blame them in some sense for trying that. But what I'm surprised by is so many people in education who willingly adopt Google's position. In my estimation, what we're trying to do as educators is different than Google. Google's trying to replace the human brain. We're trying to explore it, strengthen it, work within it, see its potential, et cetera. So in that sense, I think Google's whole mission statement is really antithetical to education. But as you point out, they're a very wealthy company, and they appear quite often within our text. And we talk about how there have been successful movements to push back against Google, and lawsuits have been brought and have succeeded. One of the lawsuits that Allison participated in, you could actually if you put your name on the lawsuit, you could get a payout. I think she got $7.70. So that illustrates another big problem, and this is where government or the law comes in, which is for companies like Google, like even if they break the law, the price is so much less than the profits made from breaking the law. And that's, I think, something that needs to change. All the incentives are in the wrong place there for them.
Excellent. We actually have a question in the chat from Jane Cubbage. I think it's a great way to kind of wrap this up. We're almost to the end of the session. Jane Cubbage asks, how can faculty be more aware and educated about these topics? The PR environment is so ingrained in higher ed today.
Yeah, it's a great question. I know it sounds so lame to say this, but I really think starting just conversations is a critical starting point. I think coming out the gate and finger wagging about the utilization of tools probably will not build a great coalition who are willing to tackle this issue constructively. But I think having conversations that we've already sort of talked about, I think, at least from my experience, you talk to faculty, it's really easy to get faculty to complain about the ways in which their students are distracted by digital tools from the learning environment. Maybe that's a potential place to start, and then ask maybe more uncomfortable questions. How have these digital tools perhaps negatively affected our teaching? What benefits do the benefits we derive from the utilization of these tools and platforms outweigh the costs? Talking about those costs. And then at least, and I think Allison agrees with me on this, I think it's a fool's errand to try and totally eradicate ed tech from, from any school. I don't think that's going to happen. Maybe I'll eat those words one day. But really talking about minimization, like, do we need all of these to get this done? Is there a different way to get this done? Those kinds of conversations. And then quite surprisingly, as we were finishing up kind of the first draft of this text back in May of 2023, this year, even the United States government in Congress, they created, with the FTC, they created some recommendations for schools to use when negotiating with these ed tech companies. And so I think just looking at those recommendations as a starting point to say, like, maybe we should have a few of these requirements before we engage with one of these companies. That can be a start to get that conversation going. And then in terms of making faculty more aware, I think that answers your question, Jane. But I think we should always keep an eye on the next generation of students as well. For a lot of these students, this unfortunately has become normal to them, that some third party like Turnitin can tell their teacher they're cheating, and so the teacher decides they plagiarized and gives them 0 credit. I think we need to work with students to talk about how new this is, how possibly unnatural this is, and we need to model in our classroom why privacy is important. I think, particularly in the last 10 or so years, I've been quite shocked at how much of people's private lives schools, require are required to know about from their faculty and their students. And so I'm thinking about things like, sorry, but during COVID, the way it was just expected to give up, private information about your health, or some of these statements that are used for people applying to schools or to work there, to go there, they're expected to give up private details about how they feel about some issues. We may want to push back against that and model a behavior that says, like, no, there's a reason why we have privacy around certain issues. This is not something the school should necessarily know unless you want to share, et cetera. So I think we should also model this in the classroom, and I think that'll help the future generations of faculty be aware of that as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Seth. Thank you, Nolan. Excellent presentation.
Thank you, Jane. Always a pleasure to see you as well.
Yes, likewise.
I'll throw out one more here, and I think one of what feels the most intrusive as far as this new generation of EdTech goes is like a Respondus lockdown browser, because it doesn't only record you while you're filling out a test or something like that, but there's also a very interesting beginning part where you have to film your entire workspace and provide a 360 of your entire thing. And I wonder, not only for the data collection and the surveillance, but also just like how that affects, by taking that extra step into a student's lives, how does that affect a faculty member's interpretation of a student? Like you don't know who I am in a classroom, but when you come home with me and see where I work, it's a whole new world of information. And I just wonder how that affects teaching itself. Like, we're talking about EdTech being surveillance, but what about how this technology enables professors to surveil their students?
Yeah, absolutely. That's something we wrestle with in the text. I think a lot of what we write in the text, I think faculty will be happy to hear. There's a lot of pro-faculty with academic freedom and union rights and things like that. But just for the thing you're bringing up there, Justin, we do push back against this as well. If faculty read this text or hear this talk and they are concerned about the excesses of surveillance, they're gonna have to wrestle with the question you just asked. Yeah, I mean, it's, I guess, convenient that you can quote unquote spot cheating, but you've also normalized surveillance of these people, these students. You've also treated these students like criminals before they've actually even done anything. And this is another product of COVID, not the health one I spoke about a second ago, but people coming into their homes and seeing their homes and where they live and how they live, all the way back to TJ Jackson Lears wrote that book, No Place for Grace, but which talked about how the home has always been a kind of a sanctuary away from the excesses of the market. Well, that got blown up during COVID and remains to this day, where these digital tools are invading the home. And so I think that's a question that what you're asking there, Justin, I think is a question faculty need to wrestle with. Is it really worth it to empower these EdTech companies to give these students a feeling of criminality just so you can possibly be proactive in potential cheating? I think that's something they're gonna have to wrestle with.
Yeah, I think you've raised a lot of great points. Thank you, everybody, for all of your questions. This session is about to wrap up. Please, Nolan, if you have anywhere that you'd like people to follow you or anything like that, please feel free. But we're going to close this up. Thank you all for attending, and please just keep coming. We got more sessions all weekend. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you, everyone. You can follow my work at projectcensored.org or substack.com/@NolanHigdon, and see a lot of familiar faces. Thank you all for turning out and supporting me. I look forward to seeing you all again soon.